Have you ever noticed that some relationships seem to become more valuable exactly in the moment that you need them? Let's say you need a client and suddenly you start to remember someone that you met at a conference a couple of months ago. And then when you need funding, LinkedIn starts to seem more interesting all of a sudden. And when you need a favor, an old contact suddenly starts to feel more important again. It's almost as if relationships gain value overnight. But I don't think that they do. I think something else is happening. The relationship suddenly didn't become valuable. It was your need that did. And that small distinction, that changes everything. I've spent years, better part of my 15 years studying relationships in business. And I don't mean networking, I mean relationships. Watching founders, CEOs, professionals across various industries, people who seem to have extraordinary access, people who somehow have received introductions and opportunities and recommendations. And from the outside, it looks like luck. It looks like that they were lucky they were at the right place at the right time, but it wasn't luck. Right? The pattern was remarkably consistent. Opportunities may have been sudden. The relationship behind those opportunities wasn't. I've started believing something that sounds very obvious at first, but has a profound consequence once you really think about it. And that is this: relationships don't create opportunities, they create options. And options become opportunities when the timing arrives, when the time's right. And that's very different. Because if you're trying to build opportunities, you'll become impatient. Naturally, you would. But if you're building options, then you would understand that many of those options may never even be exercised, and that's perfectly okay. I'll give you an example. Think about investing. If someone buys shares today, they don't expect wealth tomorrow. And if someone plants a mango tree, my favorite fruit, they don't expect the fruit next month. We understand this instinctively. But when it comes to relationships, we completely abandon this logic. We meet someone today and quietly, secretly expect business next week. And if nothing happens, we assume that the relationship wasn't valuable. Perhaps there was nothing wrong with the relationship. Maybe it was simply that we expected fruit from a tree we'd planted just yesterday. Make sense? I've also noticed something else. The way most people talk about networking reveals how they really think about relationships. Listen carefully. They'll say, you know what? I need to network. That's a very interesting sentence. They're saying, I need to network. But they're not saying that I need to build trust. They're not saying that I need to become memorable in the minds of the people that I'm meeting. They're not saying I need to become someone that people naturally think of. What they're saying is, I need to network. It's almost as if networking were an activity instead of a consequence. I sometimes wonder whether networking has developed a reputation problem. And I think about this a lot. Not because people are fake, it has nothing to do with that, but because maybe we've asked networking to do something it was never designed to do. We've expected one conversation to produce what usually takes months or years. We've tried to compress months and years of trust into a single coffee meeting. And when that feels uncomfortable, when that doesn't happen, when that doesn't produce result, we conclude that networking doesn't work, it is fake. Maybe it's networking that's not fake. Maybe our expectations are. Now, I want you to think about any meaningful relationship in your own life. Could be a close friend, could be a trusted colleague, could be someone you'd happily recommend. Now, tell me this, did that trust appear in one conversation? Of course not. It was accumulated gradually, right? That probably you can't even identify the exact moment the trust arrived. And that's how most valuable things work. You don't notice them growing. But when they come into existence, you notice them. The interesting thing about trust is that it's It's almost invisible while it's being built, but it's immediately visible when it's missing. You rarely think about trust during a successful business partnership. But the moment in that partnership trust disappears, it becomes the only thing that you can think about, you can focus on. And I love to think of this way, that trust is very similar to oxygen. When it is present, we don't notice it, it's invisible, but it's impossible to ignore when oxygen is absent. I love that analogy. And one of the biggest mistakes I think we make in business is confusing activity with progress. Meeting more people isn't necessarily progress. I want to say this again. Meeting more people isn't necessarily progress. Collecting business cards isn't progress. Adding another thousands of LinkedIn connections isn't progress. These are activities. Progress is becoming someone who occupies other people's mind for the right reasons. Because here's something that I've been thinking about recently. Opportunities really begin with a search. They begin with a memory. Think of this. Someone is sitting in a meeting, a problem comes up, and someone asks, do we know anyone who could help us in this situation? And even before Google is open, even before LinkedIn is searched, even before a consultant is hired, a name appears in someone's mind. And that moment fascinates me. Because your entire professional future, your success, may depend on whether your name appears in that moment in the mind of the right people. Right? And not because you've marketed yourself brilliantly, but because over the years, you've quietly earned a place in someone else's memory. We spend enormous amount of time trying to become visible. Perhaps we should spend more time becoming memorable for the right reasons. Visibility gets attention, but it's memory, the right memory, that gets opportunity. And they're not the same thing. I've often asked successful business owners where the biggest clients came from. And the answers are surprisingly similar. Very few of them begin with, oh, I just met this person last week, or instead, oh, I just accidentally ran into this person. Most of the answers, of course, some exceptions are there, but most of the answers begin with, oh, I've known this person for years and we met a long time ago. We stayed in touch. We did a small project together and now we're doing a big one. Or I had a relationship, I wasn't expecting anything. To others, the opportunity may feel sudden, but the relationship has been quietly developing over time without anyone having even noticed. And which makes me wonder whether we have misunderstood the sequence entirely. Perhaps opportunities don't create relationships. Perhaps relationships patiently create the conditions in which opportunities eventually become possible. And those aren't the same ideas. One is a transaction and the other is compounding. And I think understanding the difference between these two things changes the way you approach every conversation you will ever have. A few years ago, I realized that I'd been asking the wrong question. The question wasn't, how do I build a better network? The better question was, how does relationship actually become valuable? How does a relationship actually become valuable? Because when you think about it, right, not every relationship changes your life. In fact, most relationships don't. Some remain acquaintances forever, some disappear, some become friendships. And every once in a while, one relationship quietly changes the direction of your business. Why is that? And what happens between? After watching hundreds of entrepreneurs over the years, I started to notice a pattern. It's not an exact formula, and we cannot have exact formulas because human beings are far too complex for that. But it's a pattern. And the pattern is this, that a relationship doesn't become valuable overnight. It moves through stages, almost like climbing a staircase step by step. And at once I started to see this pattern, I couldn't unsee it. Let me offer you a different way of looking at this. I call it the relationship timeline. Not because every relationship follows it perfectly, but because most meaningful relationships follow something surprisingly similar. And the first stage is awareness. Someone simply knows you exist. That is called awareness. They know your name. Maybe they've met you once. Maybe they've seen you speak. Maybe they follow you online. But most people, I've seen this in the world, most people overvalue, overestimate being seen and being known. And that's understandable because recognition feels significant. Well, let me bust the bubble for you. It isn't. Being recognized is not the same as being remembered. So awareness is important, but the second stage becomes a little more important, which is familiarity. Right? Once you've crossed paths enough times with someone that you are no longer a stranger, you're no longer just a name to them. A stage where conversations start to become easier. Names no longer need an introduction, and there is comfort, not awkwardness. Most relationships, once they get to the stage, they stay here and never move beyond this point. And that's perfectly normal for a lot of relationships. But third stage is where the real game starts. And this third stage is called credibility. This is where something important changes. People stop asking, "Who are you?" and they start asking, "Can you actually deliver?" Now, credibility has very little to do with confidence. This is another misconception that people have in the world. Now, credibility is accumulated evidence. Small promises that you make, that you keep, competence that you have demonstrated, consistency in your work, in your behavior that people have observed in you. And here's something interesting. Credibility can be borrowed before it is earned. Yeah, that's very important. Every introduction is someone lending you a little bit of their reputation, which is why introductions are far more valuable than an exchange contact details with someone that you've met at an event, right? An introduction isn't an information, right? It is confidence transferred from one person to another. I've never heard people describe introductions in this way. But I think that's what's actually happening underneath the visible layers of introduction. And this brings us, once introduction starts to happen, this brings us to the next stage, which is called trust. And I think trust is one of the most misunderstood words in business. People often think trust means believing someone is capable. I don't believe. I've met many capable people I wouldn't trust, and I've met many people with average ability whom I would completely trust. Capability answers one question: can they? Right? But trust answers another important question: will they? And those are completely different questions. Right? Capability earns admiration, trust earns responsibility. And once you get to the stage of trust, then comes the most valuable stage that is there, right? And this is a stage most people are not thinking about, hardly anyone is talking about. It's a stage that I call strategic relationship. Strategic relationship is a moment when you stop being someone people know and become someone they naturally think of. Without reminders, without follow-ups, without algorithms, without advertising, you enter someone's mental shortlist. I want you to remember this term, mental shortlist. And think about that. When a problem appears, your name appears with it. That's what it is. And that's one of the most valuable positions you can occupy in someone's mind, in someone's business, in your business, if you can become that. Because opportunities don't usually begin with searches, they begin with memory. Here is a mistake I've seen people make all the time. They meet someone on Monday and they expect a strategic relationship by Friday. Imagine meeting someone today and asking them to be the best man at your wedding next week. It doesn't work, right? We'd all agree that's absurd. Yet professionally, we often do something remarkably similar. We meet someone and immediately expect referrals or ask for referrals. right? Or we meet someone and we immediately start selling to them without that familiarity, without trust coming into the equation. And when that doesn't work, we quietly conclude networking does not work. No, 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 no. It's not the timeline that failed. We simply tried to skip the stages. Right. I think that's why so many networking conversations feel uncomfortable. Not because people are insincere, but because both people know, even if subconsciously, that trust hasn't had time to exist. Human behavior is incredibly patient when it comes to growing trees, very impatient when it comes to growing relationships. Which brings me to something I've been thinking about recently. Maybe the greatest mistake in networking isn't asking for too much. Perhaps it is asking too soon. Because timing changes how identical actions are perceived. A referral request after years of relationship, after years of trust, feels completely natural. And the same request between the same two people after 5 minutes of introduction feels extremely transactional. Now think of it that the action is identical, right? But only the timeline has changed. And yet, the outcome is completely different. This made me think about staying in touch with people and what does it actually mean? I used to think that staying in touch was about remaining visible. I don't think that anymore. Now I know that it's something much deeper. It's about remaining mentally available, quietly reminding people, not that you exist, but you're still the same trustworthy person that they once knew. And that's a very different objective. One seeks attention, and the other preserves trust. And perhaps that's a real purpose of relationships, not to produce immediate business, not to maximize short-term returns, but to quietly increase the number of moments in which the right people, the right person, thinks of you at exactly the right time. Because if there's one thing I've become convinced of after 15 years, it is this. Greatest opportunities in business are rarely won. They're remembered. The more I've thought about this, the more I've realized that relationships actually don't have beginning. They have a history. Every conversation that you've had, every promise that you've kept, every introduction that you've given, every message that you've sent, every moment you showed up becomes part of that history. People remember that. And whether we realize this or not, people are constantly making decisions based on that history, not just what you have done recently, not just what you've done in the recent times. Instead, what you've consistently done over a period of time. And one of the most valuable lessons business has taught me is that people rarely make important decisions based only on logic. They make them based on confidence. Think about the last time you referred someone. Did you recommend that person? Think about the last time you referred someone. Did you recommend the absolute best person in the market, or did you recommend the person that you felt safest recommending? Those aren't always the same people, same person. It's an uncomfortable thought because it means that market doesn't always reward the most capable person. Sometimes it rewards the person who creates the least perceived risk. That's not unfair. That's human. Every recommendation is a small act of reputation. When I recommend you, I'm not only risking your reputation, I'm risking mine. And that's why introductions are so valuable. They aren't exchange of contact details, they're an exchange of confidence. And this is why I've stopped thinking of relationship as a way to grow business. Now I think of them as a way to reduce uncertainty. Business is full of uncertainties. Can I trust this person? Will they deliver? Will they disappear after the payment? Will they protect my reputation? Every meaningful relationship answers those questions long before they're ever asked. And that's why trust becomes such a powerful advantage. Not because it creates certainty, but because it removes the doubts. I've also realized something that completely changed how I think about staying in touch. For years, I thought staying in touch was about making sure that people didn't forget me. I don't think that anymore. I think that staying in touch is really about making sure that the relationship doesn't become purely transactional, that I don't reach out to people only when I need them. The moment the only reason I contact you is because I need something, that relationship starts carrying a weight it was never designed to carry. It becomes responsible for solving today's problem. And that's too much pressure on any relationship. The strongest relationships are surprisingly light, they're low maintenance. They're not constantly asking for something, they're simply alive. And there's another idea that I've been wrestling with recently. I think we've misunderstood what a network actually is. Most people imagine network as a collection of people. I don't. I think a network is a collection of trust. People are simply where the trust lives. That's a very different way of looking at it. I want you to think about this, okay? Because the question now isn't how many people do I know? That question changes. The question becomes how much trust exists for me inside my network. 100 deeply trusted relationships may be more valuable than 10,000 weak connections. And not because of quantity, but because trust has leverage. And perhaps this is why so many people become frustrated with networking. They're trying to grow the size of their network instead of increasing the quality of trust inside it. One scales contacts and the other compounds relationships. Only one of those become more valuable with time. I've also noticed that the people who constantly receive extraordinary opportunities rarely appear desperate for them. And at first I thought, and this is very interesting, at first I thought that was confidence. Now I think it's something else. Now I know that they have options, and options change behavior. When you have only one possible client, every conversation feels heavy. When you have one trusted relationship that has taken years to build, you're more patient. When you have many trusted relationships, you're free to make better decisions. Perhaps that's the hidden value of relationships. That they don't just create opportunities, they create freedom. Freedom to say no where it's necessary. Freedom to wait where it is required. Freedom to choose the kind of people that you want to work with. And I think freedom is one of the most underrated advantages in business. If I had to summarize 15 years of studying relationships in one sentence, it would probably be this. Relationships are not built for today's opportunities. They're built to give tomorrow more possibilities than today. That's why I believe relationships create options, not immediate outcomes. Most options will never even become opportunities, and that's absolutely okay. That's perfectly fine. But the thing is, you don't know which conversation will matter 5 years from now. Neither do I. And that's precisely why every meaningful conversation deserves care. Imagine someone looking at a giant oak tree, right? They admire its strength, its height, its presence. But what they don't see is the years the tree spent growing underground before anyone noticed it. Roots grow before branches, always. And business is no different. Opportunities everyone admire, they're usually the branches. The relationships are the roots. And the interesting thing about roots is that nobody applauds them when they're growing. So perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of asking, who should I meet next week? Maybe we should ask, whose trust am I patiently earning? Instead of asking, what can this relationship do for me? Maybe we should ask, what kind of relationship am I becoming for someone else? Because eventually, the quality of your business becomes limited by the quality of the trust you have built, not the numbers of people you met. I'll leave you today with one final thought. Somewhere in your phone is a name that will matter tremendously to your future. You don't know who that is. You don't know when it'll happen. You don't know why is that important. That's the nature of the future. The conversation that changes your business really feels important when you're having it. And that's why relationships demand faith. Faith that consistency matters. Faith that trust compounds. Faith that not every investment needs an immediate return. Because one day, perhaps years from now, someone will ask a simple question. Do you know anyone who could help? And if you've spent enough time quietly becoming trustworthy, your name will appear in the silence before anyone opens Google. Not because you've chased opportunity, but because you patiently became the obvious choice. And maybe that's why great relationships have always been about building trust, not about collecting contacts, not about chasing opportunities, not networking. Somewhere in your phone is a name that will matter significantly to your future. You don't know today who it is, you don't know when it's going to happen, and you don't know why that name will matter. And that's just the nature of future. We don't know the future. But the conversation that changes your business rarely feels important when you're having it today. The conversation that'll change your business tomorrow would not feel important when you're having it today. And that's why relationships demand faith. Faith that consistency matters. Faith that trust compounds. Faith that not every investment needs an immediate return. Because one day, perhaps years from now, someone will ask a simple question. Do you know anyone who could help? And if you've spent enough time quietly becoming trustworthy in the mind of right people, your name will appear in silence before anyone opens Google. Not because you chased opportunity, but because you patiently became the obvious choice. And maybe that's what great relationship building is about. Not collecting contacts, not chasing opportunities, not networking, but quietly becoming someone whose name is remembered when it matters the most. Thank you for spending this time with me today, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode.